My husband screamed at me at my father's funeral. What he said made everyone gasp. I still remember so vividly the silence that followed after he yelled at me. It wasn't a peaceful kind of silence. It was thick and suffocating. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe, hard to stand. Your father isn't even buried yet, and you're already thinking about splitting the inheritance? David's voice echoed through the entire room. Every eye turned toward me. I stood still at the podium, my hand resting on the letter I had just read aloud. It was the final letter I wrote to my father to say goodbye. Just minutes earlier, the room had been filled with quiet sobs and shared grief. Then that happened. I blinked once, then again, hoping that if I stayed still enough, time would rewind. But it didn't. In front of me, my mother was trembling. My aunt rushed to hold her because she looked like she was about to collapse. To my left were cousins, one covering her mouth, another wide-eyed in shock. Behind me were friends and neighbors, people who once called David the perfect husband. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stepped down from the podium, walked past David's bitter glare, and left the funeral hall without looking back. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just the end of a farewell. It was the end of an entire life I once believed was filled with happiness. I met David when I was 22. I had just been accepted into law school. He was already a successful financial advisor, 6 years older than me. He was mature, confident, charming, the kind of man people admired easily. We met at a dull networking event. He handed me a glass of wine, complimented my smile, and just a few hours later, I was drawn into his world. He made me feel special. I was no longer just a good daughter or a bright student. I was the woman he chose. And I felt lucky. I brought him home to meet my family full of hope. My mother welcomed him with warmth and a cozy dinner. But my father was different. He watched more than he spoke. During the entire meal, he barely said a word. That night, after David left, my father called me into the kitchen. "Rachel," he said slowly, "that guy knows how to talk. But I've met men like him before. They don't love. They just want to possess." I was angry. I told him he was old-fashioned, that he didn't understand modern love, that he should stay out of my life. If only I had listened that day. David proposed 1 year later. It was a candlelit dinner, a gold ring, a bouquet of roses. I cried from emotion. He whispered in my ear that we would build a life everyone would envy. I didn't know then that what he called building wasn't love. It was performance. The first year of our marriage felt almost perfect. David was attentive, thoughtful, intelligent. We bought a house, traveled, posted photos online like a model couple. But the cracks showed quickly. He didn't like me spending time with old friends. He tracked my bank account. He made jokes about my body, my voice, the way I was too serious like a lawyer. When I received an offer to work at a nonprofit legal aid center, I was thrilled. But David frowned. "How are we supposed to live on that kind of salary? You studied law to make money, not to do charity." So I turned it down. And every time I gave something up for him, I told myself that love meant sacrifice. That love meant patience. That putting the person you love before yourself was noble. I was wrong. 3 years into our marriage, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It broke me. I remember holding the scan results my mother sent, sitting on the bathroom floor, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my phone. David said only one thing. "How long does he have?" When I told him I wanted to go home to care for my dad, he looked at me with a cold, expressionless face. "You can't abandon your home just because your dad is sick." I looked at him in that moment, and for the first time in my life, I questioned who I had really married. But I still tried. I split my time between 2 cities, paid hospital bills, cared for my dad, comforted my mom, and came back to cook for David and manage my work by email. Every day it wore me down. David didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't say one word of sympathy. And I still stayed. Because I couldn't bring myself to leave my husband while my father was dying. Because I didn't want to break my mother's heart. Because a part of me still hoped he would change. It was a rainy afternoon when I came home earlier than planned. Work at the law office where I was temporarily helping out ended early, and I decided not to tell David. I just wanted to walk into the bedroom, change clothes, and lie down to ease the weight pressing on my chest. But the house was unusually quiet. There was no music, no sound from the TV. The kitchen was unnaturally tidy. A faint light came from the bedroom. I'm not sure what made me move so carefully, but something in my heart already knew something wasn't right. I stepped closer to the door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard laughter. A woman's voice. Sweet, intimate. Then I heard David's voice. Deep, gentle. I don't remember exactly how I opened the door. All I know is that when I stood there watching him holding another woman in our bed, I didn't feel anything. No anger, no screaming, just emptiness. She turned to look at me. It was Emily, my former coworker, the one who used to sit next to me in meetings, who borrowed my pen and my coffee mug. The one who once asked me, "How do you keep such a busy man like David so in love with you?" David didn't panic. He simply sat up, pulled the blanket over himself, and smirked at me like I was a stranger. "You're home early, that's good. Maybe this should end now." I didn't respond. I looked at the two of them, then turned and walked away. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't ask why, because I already knew the answer. David didn't betray me because he loved Emily. He betrayed me because I was no longer the naive woman constantly trying to please him. Because I had started spending time with my father. Because I no longer placed him above everything else. I wanted to leave right then. I wanted to pack my things and go straight to my mother's house. But I didn't. Because when I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw my father's photo on the table, the one where he was smiling brightly on my graduation day, I knew I had to wait just a little longer. My father didn't have much time left. I couldn't put my mother through another shock. I would stay silent. Wait until the funeral was over. Then I would leave. For good. In the days that followed, I lived like a shadow in the house. I didn't speak to David. I ate alone, slept on the couch, avoided every glance. David acted like nothing had happened. He went to work, dressed well, sent emails as if cheating on me was a normal part of life. I didn't know if he told Emily that I had found out. I didn't care anymore. My father passed away 1 week later. I was at the hospital with my mother. I held his hand as he took his final breath. I didn't shed a tear. Just an overwhelming sense of hollowness, as if I had already run out of tears long before that moment. David didn't come to the hospital. He only sent a text. "I'll be at the funeral. Let me know the time." I read it and deleted it. I didn't want him there, but I didn't have the strength to stop him. My mother was too broken to care. The day of the funeral, it poured. Rain came down hard from morning until late afternoon. I wore a simple black dress and pinned to it the golden brooch my father had given me on my 20th birthday. I wore no makeup. I didn't talk to many people. I stood by the casket, listening to every sigh, every condolence, every silent handshake. David arrived late. He wore a suit, his hair perfectly styled, his face cold like he was attending a meeting. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my mother. He stood in a corner, like a stranger with no connection to the man we were burying. I stepped up to the podium, my hands slightly trembling. But when I spoke, my voice was steady. I spoke about my father, a stern but compassionate man. Someone who always watched over me quietly. A man who taught me what it means to live with integrity and how to stand tall when everything is falling apart. I read the letter I had written for him. Words of gratitude, words of regret, and words of goodbye. The room fell silent. People cried quietly. My mother gripped my hand tightly as I stepped down. And then David stood up. I don't know what made him do it. Maybe it was suppressed shame. Maybe it was anger because he could no longer control me. Or maybe the truth of who he was could no longer be hidden. He stepped forward and raised his voice into the funeral hall. Her father isn't even buried yet, and she's already planning the inheritance. What a performance. I stood frozen. A gasp came from the right side of the room. Someone dropped their purse. My mother sobbed and nearly collapsed. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. Then I turned and walked away. This time, I didn't look back. I don't remember exactly how I left the funeral. I only remember hands trying to hold me back, the stunned faces of relatives, and the sound of my footsteps echoing through the long hallway that suddenly felt drained of all color. Rain was still falling outside. I walked down the path to the parking lot without an umbrella. No one followed me. No one said a word. Because the truth was already too obvious. In the middle of everyone's grief, David had torn off the gentleman mask he used to wear so proudly. He was no longer the model husband, no longer the successful man everyone admired. He was the man who used my father's death as an excuse to shame me in public. I drove home in silence, my mind completely blank. Everything blurred behind the rain-covered windshield. I didn't cry. The pain had gone past tears. It was quiet, lingering, and more brutal than any physical wound. When I got home, David was already there. He was standing in the kitchen with a wine glass in his hand, looking like nothing had happened. When he saw me, he only said one thing. "You're being dramatic." I didn't answer. I went straight upstairs, locked the door, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself collapse and cry. Not just because of what he said, but because of all the years I had wasted. Because of the love I had once believed in. Because my father was gone, and he would never get to see his daughter truly free. The next day, I took time off. I told David I needed to take care of the paperwork after the funeral. In truth, I just wanted to stay at my parents' house. It was the only place where I still felt a trace of peace. My mother was almost broken. She barely spoke. Her eyes were dark and tired, and she had grown thinner after just a few sleepless nights. I stayed with her, helping her sort through old photos, familiar objects, and the fragments of memories we both held onto. While cleaning my father's study, I found an old wooden box locked with a small latch. Inside were documents, notebooks, and a letter with handwriting on the envelope that said, "To Rachel, open only when you truly need to." I sat down at his desk. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. The first line made my heart ache. "My dear, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer with you." I bit my lip, trying to hold back tears. My father was never one to speak much, but he was always thoughtful. In the letter, he wrote that he had been watching David for a long time. That he had once seen him enter a hotel with another woman, but said nothing because he didn't want to hurt me. He knew I was strong-willed. If he had told me back then, I would have thought he was interfering. "I only wanted you to be happy," he wrote. "But sometimes happiness doesn't come from holding on to a man. It comes from having the courage to let go of what doesn't deserve you." I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, like I was trying to hold on to the last warmth he left behind. All my anger faded. All that remained was a deep sadness and a voice in my mind that said clearly, "It's time to end this." The next day, I called an old friend who is now a family lawyer. I gave her a brief version of everything, leaving out the harshest details. She was silent for a moment, then said with calm certainty, "You can win this, Rachel, and I'll be here if you need anything." We started gathering evidence. I printed old messages, flagged suspicious financial transactions, and saved voice recordings of his verbal abuse. I remembered everything, every word, every time he tore me down. I didn't tell David. I didn't say anything. I still came home every night, still sat at the dinner table. But we didn't speak. I was no longer the woman who once bent to make peace. I was not a victim anymore. I was someone who had woken up. David noticed the change. One night, he looked at me, suspicious. "What are you doing? Is there something I don't know?" I looked at him. I didn't say a word. I just stared at him for a long time, then turned away. My silence was the clearest answer I could give. When everything was ready, I wrote him a letter. Just a few lines. I didn't want to explain. I didn't need to blame him. In the letter, I told him I knew everything. About Emily. About the disdain he always tried to hide behind his polished words. I told him my father had seen through him from the start, and that he had let me fall so I could learn how to rise again, with dignity. I left the letter on his desk, along with a copy of my father's note. That morning, I walked out of the house with a small suitcase. I didn't take much, just the things that mattered, things that belonged to me, things no one could take away. David was still asleep when I left. Maybe he thought everything would go back to the way it was, that I would forgive him again, that I would retreat. He was wrong. I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because I no longer wanted to live a life defined by endurance. I returned to my childhood home. My mother didn't ask questions. She just held me tight when I said, "I'll be staying here for a while." That night, I made tea for the two of us and played the music my father loved. For the first time, I felt something lift inside me. I cried quietly. But this time, it was to say goodbye. Goodbye to the man I once loved. Goodbye to the marriage I thought would keep me safe. Goodbye to the version of me who held on too long. And hello to someone new. A woman who finally understood that self-respect is worth more than holding on to someone who never deserved her. A week later, David called me. 3 times. I didn't answer. He left messages. He said we needed to talk. He said he was sorry. He said I was destroying everything. I didn't reply, because he no longer had the right to speak, not after everything he had done. The first month after I left was filled with silence. I didn't reach out to anyone. I stayed off social media. I didn't tell any of our mutual friends that we had separated, and I didn't speak about what had happened. I just needed time and space. Time to breathe, to understand where I was standing, to begin healing. Each morning, I woke up in my old room at my mother's house. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, making everything feel softer. I brewed a cup of tea, tended to the garden my father once cared for, and read books I had neglected during the years I was married. One morning, my mother stood by the window watching me. Then she whispered, "You're finally smiling again." I hadn't realized it, but she was right. I started rewriting my resume, sending it to small legal aid organizations I once dreamed of working for back in college. A week later, I received an invitation from a nonprofit legal center in the suburbs. They needed someone skilled, dedicated, and empathetic enough to listen to the struggles of those who had no voice. I said yes, without hesitation. For the first time in years, I worked without fear of judgment. I wore what I liked. I spoke my mind. I didn't need anyone's permission to simply exist. My world was smaller than before, but it was more peaceful and more real. Meanwhile, David began to unravel. I didn't go looking for news about him. It came to me through acquaintances, through messages from people who used to know us both. They told me his company was in trouble after a video clip went viral online. Someone had posted footage of him yelling at me at my father's funeral. It was only a few seconds long, but it caused a stir. People were outraged. They called him heartless. Some smaller news sites picked up the story. Even though I didn't speak out, the public saw enough to understand what kind of man he truly was. A few brands cut ties with him. Business partners turned cold. Former clients walked away. David had always been good at staying in control. But this time, he couldn't control public opinion. And he couldn't deny what he had done when the proof was right there for everyone to see. I didn't feel joy when I heard all of this. But I didn't feel sorry either. because it wasn't punishment. It was consequence. A reflection of what he had planted over the years. A month after I left, David called me again. I still didn't answer, but this time he sent a message longer than the others. I know you won't read this, but I still want to say, I was wrong. Not just once. Many times. I lost you, and now I see I've lost everything. If I could go back, I'd do it differently. But I know I won't get another chance. I read it once. Just once. Then I deleted it. I don't keep things that once hurt me. After that, I officially filed for divorce. Quietly, without drama. My lawyer and I had prepared everything. Enough evidence, a smooth process. David didn't argue. He just signed and sent the papers back. The day I held the divorce certificate in my hands, I stood by the window for a long time, staring at the sky filled with soft white clouds. The feeling wasn't exactly happiness, but it was relief. Like taking off a coat that had become too tight, too heavy, and no longer mine. I was no longer someone's wife. I was just me. I started a blog to share my journey. I didn't name names, I didn't give details. I simply wrote about pain, about how women often suffer in silence to protect a family, and why letting go is sometimes the bravest thing we can do. To my surprise, hundreds of people read it. Many women messaged me. They wrote about suffocating marriages, about hidden pain, about feeling lonely inside their own homes. I replied to every message. Gently, honestly. I wasn't trying to be someone great. I only shared one truth my father had once taught me. You don't need a man to complete you. You just need yourself. I hung his photo in my new workspace, the one where he was smiling in the backyard beside his rose bushes. I looked at it whenever I felt lost. He was still here, in my heart, in every choice I made, in every step I took forward. One afternoon, while I was teaching a group of women basic legal rights at the center, one of them stared at me for a while before she said, "You're different from the others who come here. You talk like someone who's been through terrible things, but your eyes are peaceful." I smiled. I didn't respond, because I understood I no longer needed to tell the whole story. I had lived it. I had walked through the darkness. And now I didn't need anyone to acknowledge it but myself. I never thought I would see David again. I didn't hope for it. I had closed that chapter of my life. Page by page, I had burned it with silence, with steady footsteps, and with months of quiet healing. But life always seems to have its way of bringing back the people we once ran from, and always at the moment we least expect. It was a Friday afternoon. I had just finished a legal consultation with a young woman who had suffered emotional abuse from her husband. I was tired, but my heart felt light. Watching her walk out of that room with her head held higher, I knew the work I was doing mattered. I was packing up my documents, ready to leave the center, when the receptionist called out. "Rachel, there's someone waiting for you in the lobby. He says he's your ex-husband." I froze. I had heard things about David from others, that he had spiraled, that he had lost major contracts, that Emily, the woman he left me for, had walked away after getting caught in the storm of public backlash. But I didn't pay attention. I didn't want to know more. My life no longer had space for any of that. I walked into the lobby, more composed than I expected. And there he was. David was sitting in the waiting area. He looked thinner than I remembered. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes revealing a fatigue he couldn't hide. When he saw me, he stood up quickly, then hesitated as if unsure where to begin. I said nothing. We stood there in a heavy moment that seemed to stretch time. And then I broke the silence. "What do you want?" My voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't soft either. It was calm, like I was speaking to a stranger who had returned to a place he no longer belonged. David looked at me for a long time. Then he spoke slowly. "I need to talk to you. Just once. not to ask for forgiveness, just so you understand. I didn't make any promises, but I walked with him to the little cafe across the street, a place I had visited many times while writing my blog. I chose a table on the patio where the breeze made everything feel less heavy. We sat across from each other. Between us was an old wooden table, just enough space to make touching impossible, but not far enough to pretend we were strangers. David was quiet for a long time. Then he began to speak. That after I left, everything inside him collapsed. Not because I was gone, but because for the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly. A cold, selfish man who had always put his pride above everything else. He said he never believed I would leave. He thought I needed him. He assumed that if things ever cracked, I would be the one to bend, the one to endure. But he was wrong. "Why did you scream at me during the funeral?" I asked. Not because I needed an apology, but because I wanted to hear him admit it. David lowered his head. "I saw you standing there too strong. You read that letter to your father without a single tear. You spoke like you didn't need anyone, not even me. And I panicked." I was silent. The truth was, I hadn't needed him for a long time. But I lied to myself. I had ignored the cruelty, made excuses for the hurt, all because I was afraid of life alone. And when I finally chose to stand up, he couldn't handle it. David sighed. "I was jealous of your father. He understood you more than I ever did. He showed up for you in quiet moments. And I only ever took. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Part of me wanted to say it was too late. But another part just felt light. I didn't need his guilt to forgive him. I had already forgiven. Not for him, but for me." "What will you do now?" I asked. David looked at me. His eyes were tired, but no longer lost. "I'm leaving the city. I need to start over. Maybe somewhere no one knows who I am." I nodded. Not in approval, not in protest. Just a soft nod, as if acknowledging that everyone deserves the chance to begin again. "Are you okay?" he asked. I looked up and met his eyes. "I'm okay. For the first time in years." We parted ways outside the cafe. No hug, no handshake, no promises to stay in touch. I watched him disappear into the crowd. His figure grew smaller, blurred, faded like an old memory. And I turned away. I didn't look back. After that final meeting with David, I returned home with a feeling I hadn't known in years. It wasn't joy, nor was it excitement. It was a quiet kind of peace, the kind that seeps into your breath. A calmness that comes when you know you've finished a journey completely, left nothing undone, and have nothing left to carry. I sat alone in my old room. My mother had gone to bed. The lights in the house were off. I played a soft jazz tune and opened the window to let the breeze in. It carried the scent of jasmine from the backyard garden, the one my father used to tend every weekend. I thought of him. I thought of the letter he left behind. I thought of the final line he wrote. "If you choose freedom, I'll be smiling from afar." I had chosen freedom, and now I was living it. Freedom doesn't mean the absence of pain. It's not a door to paradise. It's a journey. It's waking up each day and choosing not to let fear run your life. It's sitting alone in a cafe and smiling at your reflection in the window. I began building a new life. Quietly, but with meaning. I moved into a small apartment near the city center. Cream-colored walls, a balcony filled with green plants, and a wooden bookshelf I spent a month organizing. Every book on that shelf reminded me of a different version of myself. The hopeful law student, the patient wife, the daughter crushed by loss. And now, the woman who no longer needs anyone's approval to feel whole. I continued my work at the legal center. Every week, I met dozens of women carrying painful stories. Some had been abused, some abandoned, some unsure whether to stay or to leave. I didn't give advice. I didn't tell them what to do, I just sat with them, listened, and shared my own journey. Just enough. So they could see that even painful roads can lead to light. Over time, I became a source of quiet strength for many. Not because I was perfect, but because I was honest. I didn't hide my scars. I didn't pretend I had all the answers. I spoke of my mistakes as lessons. And somehow that made others feel less alone. One day, a young woman walked into the office, her eyes full of worry. She sat down and asked, her voice trembling, "Are you the woman who wrote the blog, The Divorce at the Funeral?" I nodded, surprised. She looked at me for a long time, then whispered, "I used to think I couldn't live without that man. But after reading your story, I realized I deserve more." I didn't respond. I just smiled and handed her a cup of tea. Sometimes healing begins with something that small. I also began painting again. Simple watercolor sketches, mostly of landscapes or quiet moments, a woman reading beneath the sun, an old porch wrapped in bougainvillea, a hand reaching out into the rain. I didn't sell the paintings. I hung them around my apartment as reminders that I can create beauty. With the same hands that once trembled from grief, every weekend I walked around the lake near my home. Sometimes alone, sometimes with my mother, sometimes even with Emily, the woman who once broke my marriage but later became the first to offer a sincere apology. Emily no longer lived in David's shadow. She had moved to a small town, teaching art to children with disabilities. We met again by chance. And instead of anger, I chose to listen. I never thought I could forgive her. But I realized that forgiveness is not about giving someone else a second chance. It's about giving yourself an exit. I learned how to love again. Not another man, but myself. I took care of my body. I set boundaries. I said no when I needed to. I went to bed early, ate better, and stopped blaming myself for things I couldn't control. 1 year after my father passed, I held a small gathering at home. I invited close friends and the remaining family. We lit candles, shared old stories, and took a moment of silence for him. I stood up to speak. Nothing was prepared. I just said what my heart told me to say. My father once taught me that kindness is never weakness, that if you fall, fall with purpose. And if you rise, rise with your whole heart. Today, I want to say, I've risen, Dad. And I'm grateful that you always believed I could. After that day, I sat down and wrote my entire story. Every part, every chapter, every memory. And I titled the manuscript, Her Side of the Story. Because I believe that in every story that has been twisted, cut short, or told by someone else, there is always a part where the woman deserves to be heard. And this is mine. I used to believe I would always be the victim in my own story. But then I realized I didn't need anyone else to stand up for me. I could stand up on my own and rewrite the parts that were missing. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. I've been weak. I've accepted things I never should have. But I made it through with awareness and a deep belief in my own worth. If you're feeling lost in your pain and silence, remember this. You have the right to rewrite your story. And that story deserves to be heard. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. This is part of Her Side of the Story, where we share the stories women deserve to tell in their own voice. Subscribe if you believe that every woman has the right to speak her truth.